Firstly, congratulations on assembling the Reality Check series of articles on the World Bank's World Development Report, Learning to Realize Education's Promise. The series is a tremendous resource and will be very useful for a whole range of people. Before talking about my own contribution to the series, I want to mention 2 points. One is that the history of the World Bank's involvement in education and for development is really a negative one. Despite all the World Bank's consultative forums, its policy discussions, as well as a large amount of evidence-based criticism of the World Bank's work, this World Development Report is not really a departure from its past paradigms or really an honest appraisal of the harm that previous World Bank policies has caused. The World Bank requires of their own aid recipients evidence-based data on the use of their funds, but it's ironic because it exempts itself from rigorous appraisal. The World Bank does not acknowledge its complicity and legacy in imposing disastrous education policies on low-income countries and through, for example, the structural adjustment policies. And these policies included support for user fees in the past, the continuing privatization of schooling, and previously the neglect of early childhood development, of higher education in poorer countries, large class sizes, caps on the salaries of teachers, generally disparaging of teachers' work, and overall cuts in expenditure to education, encouraging these cuts in different nation states. The new world, this present report, it concedes that private schools do not necessarily deliver better results. And to quote the World Bank, it talks about how private schools could possibly also deepen social cleavages. It talks about social segregation and how families can be seduced by really companies taking advantage of them to increase profits. Now, these are facts long understood by non-World Bank researchers, but really in practice, the World Bank continues to promote privatization, and very importantly, the World Bank's investment arm, the International Finance Corporation, aggressively and practically supports what they call low-cost or low-fee private schools in poorer countries. So we've witnessed over the past decade a rapid growth of these schools, notorious for employing unqualified teachers with low salaries and in many countries very few labor rights. And this practice also undermines education as a human right, and it perpetuates inequality in society. So similarly, the laudable emphasis in the World Development Report on early childhood development, really impressively bolstered by evidence from neuroscience, is also tempered by the reality that under neoliberalism, education in the crucial early years is out of reach for the vast majority of the poor in many countries, and when it exists, it's largely managed by edupreneurs for profit, often supported by the World Bank. Now, many of us thought that the inauguration of Jim Yong Kim as the new president of the World Bank, who was perceived as a critical intellectual and who had an important earlier role in AIDS treatment advocacy, that did give the tarnished image of the World Bank newfound credibility. But unfortunately, we've all been dismayed by Kim's support of privatization around the world. Shortly after Kim's inauguration, about 100 organizations, including 30 key Ugandan and Kenyan education organizations, criticized Kim's support for the for-profit fee-charging chain of private primary schools based in Kenya and Uganda. That's Bridge International Academies. And the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, invested millions in the BIA, Bridge International, for their expansion in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and India. And in one of his earliest speeches, Kim praised Bridge International, and the evidence, of course, is certainly not praiseworthy. In many other countries, the IFC supports private schools. In my own country, South Africa, they've supported Curo, one of the biggest for-profit school groups in South Africa, and its expansion. And quite recently, they've been investing millions, in fact $22 million in the South African-based private group Advitech to support its expansion both in South Africa and the rest of Africa. And this shows the disconnect between the content and the rhetoric of the World Development Report and the actual investment and funding policies of the bank. The World Bank Development Report also contains significant silences and omissions. And really, for a bank, however it might style itself, the glaring neglect of mechanisms and details to really fund the World Development Report's own recommendations is irresponsible. There's no mechanism to do this. And in fact, in the absence of these mechanisms and the practice of the World Bank's investment arms, instead of dealing with what the report calls the education crisis, it will in fact exacerbate this very learning crisis. There are many other omissions as well in the World Development Report, including higher education and rights in and through education. And of course, the imperative to nurture local institutional capacity and the quality of higher education in low-income countries is absolutely vital, but this is neglected. There are other omissions as well, and generally the World Bank's report once again elevates economic growth. And really, this elevation in the time of climate change, in the epoch of climate change, will dangerously exacerbate climate change itself. Also, understanding and resisting climate change is in itself an important learning outcome, but this is not talked about in the World Development Report. Now, colleagues have written extensively on different aspects of the report in the series of articles that EI has collated. And some of these critiques, even when they acknowledge the sensible parts of the World Bank's report, refer to the contradictions between the stated diagnosis of what the World Bank calls the learning crisis and the practices. And they call this, many of them call this, and including myself, organized hypocrisy. Now, these inconsistencies are not new, nor are they limited to the area of education. In my blog, I talk about a very recent World Bank report called The Changing Wealth of Nations, and this report was published in January of this year on the heels of the World Development Report. And this report too, while providing evidence of the looting of resource-rich countries, largely in Africa, by vested foreign interests, the policies of the bank remain oriented to enforcing loan repayments and really transnational corporate repatriation, reinforcing the plunder through rampant mineral, oil and gas extraction. And these resource-rich countries face what many have called a resource curse. Despite the increasing extraction of their natural riches, they are getting poorer. The director of the Oakland Institute, Frederick Mousseau, in fact, argues that this is the usual schizophrenia of the bank. It calls for better governance, stronger institutions, while also simultaneously advocating for pro-business, pro-market policies. And he poses the question, how can low-income countries build stronger institutions while the bank pushes them to deregulate, cut taxes, and thereby, in fact, reduce the resources available for public intervention in the economies. Oxfam has also shown that 51 of the 68 companies that the IFC lent money to and who finance investments in sub-Saharan Africa also use tax havens to avoid paying taxes for their investment. So the issue of tax justice and tax evasions is directly related to development, including a bigger domestic budget allocation for education in poorer countries. So what I try to show is that for many decades, people have talked about how poorer countries and the people in those countries, particularly those marginalized, have been severely and adversely affected. And I'm afraid to say that, unfortunately, these practices and the consequences of the World Bank and other such institutions like the IMF continue to ravage many countries around the world today, and including education in those countries. Thank you.